Vlad Dracula, one of the most vicious and brutal men to ever live, ruled Wallachia with an iron fist. More than 500 years after his death, his name still strikes fear into all who hear it. In an effort to separate fact from fiction and uncover the mysteries of Dracula's life, I traveled through the wilds of Romania, retracing Vlad's journey from captive prince to scourge of the Balkans. Join me now as we follow in the footsteps of Vlad Dracula. In my quest to learn more about Vlad Dracula's life, I decided to start with his death. My first stop was Snagov Monastery, an island monastery just north of Bucharest. Snagov is also the most probable location of the tomb of Vlad Dracula. Now, there's some speculation among historians about whether Vlad is actually buried there or not. I've done a fair amount of research into it, and Kamenia Monastery, which is south of Bucharest, is sometimes posited as a place where he's been buried, but there's not really any evidence to support that, and that's not a claim that came around until the monastery started making it in, I think, late 1990s or early 2000s, in an effort to try and get some tourists to come visit their rather out-of-the-way location. So Snagov Monastery is really the place where local legend says he's buried there and has for hundreds of years. If you look at the location where Vlad was actually executed, where he died, it was maybe 20, 30 miles away from the monastery. He had connections to the monastery. His brother, Vlad the monk, was actually the abbot at Snagov Monastery for a while. And he also Vlad himself stored some of his treasure there. And it's rumored that his treasure is still buried in the bottom of the lake. One local legend says that he had the abbots of the monastery gather up all of his treasure and keep it in their fortress in the monastery. And then when the Turks were invading, led by Radu the Handsome, they took the treasure, fearful that the monastery would be taken over and the treasure would be taken, and then they would have to answer to Vlad the Impaler. They took his treasure and actually sunk it in the river to try to keep it out of the hands of Radu and the invading Turks. And so if that legend is correct, then his treasure, which would be substantial today, would still be there someplace on the grounds of the monastery. Now that lake, believe it or not, it's not a very big lake, but it's one of the deepest in all of Eastern Europe. So to my knowledge, no divers have ever actually gone down and tried to look for it. Of course, today it would be under tons of silt and debris and everything else. So the chances of finding it are pretty remote. But to undertake an expedition to look at the bottom of the lake for Vlad the Impaler's lost treasure would be a pretty awesome undertaking. But I couldn't do that. I don't have the resources, and I'm not that good of a swimmer. So I actually just visited the monastery. It's not very far out of the way. It's probably about 30 minutes north of Bucharest. Take sort of a main road, and then there's a couple of roads you take off to get there. And you have to park your car outside of the lake. And then there's a bridge that you cross to get to the monastery. And the day that I went, the monastery was extremely quiet. There was nobody there. In fact, the only other person on the island besides me was this young kid who was in charge of just taking your ticket and making sure you didn't steal anything from the monastery while you're in there. So the main sanctuary building is where Vlad's tomb is, and it's located in the floor. Now, I want to give you a sort of disclaimer here. In the 1930s, that tomb was actually opened and found to be empty, essentially. There were some animal bones, but nothing really significant there. But then that's the story everybody tells. The story they don't tell is the excavators and archaeologists kept looking, and they actually did find a tomb probably about 10 feet or so back from where that spot is, unmarked. And in there, they found the remains of a human being with a gold crown that was falling to pieces and some very expensive jewelry that would not have belonged to a nobody. And again, this was an unmarked tomb, probably about 10 feet or so away from the tomb where Vlad is reputedly buried. It is hypothesized that
Vlad was potentially originally buried in the place that is currently called his tomb, right in front of the altar of the monastery, and then it was moved back towards the door at some later date. I looked at both sites inside there. You can't really do anything because there's a guy standing right there who's checking on you to make sure you don't lift up the tomb and take out some vital pieces of relics. So I wasn't able to do that. I think it's unquestionably his resting place. The body they found, the remains are most likely his. And you know, there's another interesting thing about Orthodox Romanian monasteries. So at that time, in the 13 to 1500s, it was extremely common to bury nobles and notable people in the floors of the monastery, in the crypts. And this is a practice that is undertaken elsewhere as well. You know, in England, you've got Westminster Abbey. Tons of princes and kings are buried in the floor of that abbey. That's just the way it's done. So, Romanian Orthodox monasteries, it's exactly the same. But the thing about the Romanian monasteries is, and I went to several of them while I was in Romania, all of the graves are outside of the main sanctuary. They're in this sort of antechamber as you walk in, the lobby of the sanctuary. So as you walk in, there's this kind of antechamber, and the graves, the crypts, are all lined up along both sides of the walls. They're not in the actual main walking area for the most part, except for this one. This grave is not just right there in the middle of the floor, right in front of the entryway into the main altar. This is a place where every single parishioner would pass. This is a place where the abbot would be basically standing all day. And so it's a high traffic area. They would not generally put someone who is respected in a spot like that. So, and also it's horizontal. All the graves, the tombstones, are all vertical facing in context of the direction the abbey is built or the monastery is built. This is the only one that I saw while I was there in any monastery that was horizontal facing. Very, very unusual. So these things combined together, suggest very strongly that this was an exceptional person that was buried there. Potentially an exceptionally evil person. That's why everything is different. That's why the grave is or the tombstone is sideways. It's why he was put in a high traffic area. The idea is that, and remember, Orthodox dogma is a little different than other Christian faiths. But the idea is that by being trampled by the feet of the penitents, that Vlad's soul would be elevated and possibly be able to be redeemed and enter heaven. Especially because at the end of his life, he did convert to Catholicism, which was not a good thing for the Orthodox to have happen. But he had to do that to be able to be endeared to the King of Hungary, the King of Hungary at that time. So anyways, I really do believe that Snagov Monastery is the final resting place of Vlad the Impaler. While I was there, I tried to figure out can I even open this thing? Could I actually get into the grave? But it's cemented shut. I mean, you'd need a jackhammer and a pry bar and everything else to try and get in there. But I was in there by myself for probably about an hour and was able to examine the grave itself and all the surrounding features of the monastery. The outside area of the monastery is really cool too. I was hoping to maybe dig around a little bit in the backyard there and find some artifacts, but that didn't happen. The place was pretty cleaned out. And again, archaeological expeditions have been to this site for the past almost 100 years now. And if there was anything to be found, they probably have found it already. One interesting thing, the bones that were recovered from Vlad's tomb, or 10 feet behind Vlad's tomb in the 1930s, those were taken to a history museum in Bucharest and were since lost. So no one is 100% sure where those bones are now. If we could find those, the whole mystery would be completely put to rest. And they're probably in a box in some museum storage someplace. Whoever knew where they were has died since then. So they may be lost for many more years until some researcher or museum employee finds this box, a little shoe box, and says, hey, what's in here? And discovers, hey, these are the bones of Vlad the Impaler. So the upside is they're probably preserved, and if you can get those bones, you
probably do DNA analysis on Vlad's living descendants and figure out, hey, this is actually the bones of Vlad the Impaler.